Now let's specifically hone in on the settlement of Virginia. In the 1570s, a man named Humphrey Gilbert went to the Queen, Queen Elizabeth, also known as the Virgin Queen. This is where we get the name Virginia from. And he got the permission to attempt to colonize, that is, to send people who would actually live in the colony of Virginia. Well, his attempt failed. He was lost at sea in 1583. But his half-brother, Sir Walter Raleigh, inherited the permission or the patent, and he picked up the project where his brother left off. It was Raleigh that actually dubbed the area Virginia after the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I. And in 1585, he attempted to settle a town or a city, a little village called Roanoke. But Roanoke, the first attempt to settle Roanoke, the settlers were discontent and they wanted to go home, so it kind of fell apart. Well, a couple years later, another attempt to settle in Roanoke, Virginia was implemented by a man named John White. He took the settlers, he basically dropped them off on the shores of what's now North Carolina, and then he decided he would go back to England to pick up more provisions, perhaps more settlers, and keep coming back. Well, when he went back home to England, that's when he discovered that a war had broken out between the English and the Spanish. It's called the War of the Spanish Armada. It was a naval war, and the Queen said she needed every possible ship that was available to fight against the Spanish. So John White was not permitted to go back to Roanoke for some time, for about 2 or 3 years. After the War of the Spanish Armada ended and the English were victorious, White returned to Roanoke, to England, and he found an intact village. There was no sign of any struggle or any massacre, and yet there were no people there. All the people had vanished. Where did they go? They left a mark on a tree that said Croatoan, C-R-O-A-T-O-A-N, perhaps some kind of signal that they had gone off with the Croatoan Indians. They were exterminated by the Indians. We simply don't know. This is one of the great mysteries of American history. Whatever happened to the first Virginia colonists in Roanoke? The best conjecture seems to suggest that they, in fact, integrated with Native Americans. There's a tribe in that area these days called the Lumbees, and they claim to be the descendants of the lost colony of Roanoke. Well, again, they attempt to colonize in 1607. And for the first time, there'll be a successful English colony. Now, by successful, I simply mean they'll survive, and their children and their children, their children's children will survive to this very day. The town they'll go into, now remember, Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, and James I became the king. James is now the king, and so their new settlement is properly named Jamestown. The people who went to Jamestown were largely entrepreneurs interested in finding gold, finding the Northwest Passage, finding all kinds of luxuries and benefits that they could bring back to England and be wealthy and live off of their spoils. They took very few women with them to Jamestown, which indicates that they weren't really planning on staying for very long. But they settled in a portion of the Chesapeake area, which is just overwhelmed with mosquitoes. So there was a tremendous amount of yellow fever. They didn't work. They weren't willing to get out and hunt or farm, and so they ended up starving pretty quickly on. Some of them were even reduced to cannibalism because they were starving so badly. It's referred to as the starving time in Jamestown. One of their leaders, John Smith, perhaps the most famous of the Jamestown colonists, was taken captive by Chief Powhatan of the Powhatan Indians, and according to his own testimony, he was rescued from execution by the king's daughter, Pocahontas, who threw herself upon him as they were about to execute them. Well, instead of finding gold, The Jamestown settlers actually did find a very prosperous economic substance. Not gold, not silver, but tobacco. Indian tobacco. They could plant it, they could grow it, and people in Europe, both England and France and other parts, they just love this stuff. And so tobacco became a great cash crop for the people in Jamestown. The more they grew, the richer they would become. And the more they grew, the more laborers they needed. So by 1619, in Jamestown, they start importing African and African slaves. That's a beginning of a very difficult topic in American history. The history of slavery begins in Jamestown in 1619 for the purpose of producing mass amounts of tobacco for a European market. They also bring with them European government traditions. They start a House of Burgesses, which is a form of representative government, in that same year, 1619, and that continued to all the way up to the Revolution to influence the government of Virginia. In 1624, the charter was revoked for Jamestown. It became a royal colony, but then as they continued to grow more and more tobacco, and as they began to import more and more African slaves, Virginia, particularly the Tidewater area, became a very prosperous and wealthy place, at least for the planters. Now, as far as the indentured servants and the slaves were concerned, it probably wasn't that luxurious or fun, but Jamestown was the first permanent English colony in the Americas. We'll pick up with New England next time.